Hello there and good afternoon. Welcome to this week's Q&A with Michael Clarke, all about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Professor Clarke, thank you very much for being with us. Another week has passed without ceasefire. There's the promise of ceasefire for at least 3 days next week. We'll see where we are by that point. But for this week, thank you very much for submitting all your questions. As always, we do appreciate it. Lots of really good ones again. And of course, if you are watching us on the app or even on YouTube, do submit a question as you're watching along, and we'll try and get to it if we can. Professor Clarke, always willing to answer questions on the fly. And because it worked so well last week, we're going to do another quick fire round, Michael. I got told off for being a bit too rude to you last week, keeping you to 30 seconds. So I'll try and be nicer this time. Told off in the comments. What a thing. All right, let's get on with it. The first question here from a handle I think we can all agree with. Hope things will get better soon. The question here is about Belarus. Zelensky has said Russia is preparing something in Belarus. What could this be?
Yeah, I mean, it may be a northern offensive, which the Russians are thinking about. It won't almost certainly be Belarusian troops. Belarusian troops have never been involved in this war directly. But the original invasion in February 2022 was launched largely from Belarus. I mean, that was about a third of the front, and they came over the Belarusian border. Didn't do them a lot of good, incidentally, because they're in the Pripyat marshes as soon as they came over in February. But the Ukrainians have been saying for a while now that the Russians are preparing quite a big northern offensive in Kharkiv, and then, which is the Russian border, and then a bit further west across the Belarusian border. It's not clear whether that's really going to happen. The argument is that the Russians have got 65 to 70,000 troops there. But they normally have quite a lot of troops. That's part of the Western Russia region. And, of course, they had 50,000 troops in Kursk in fighting to regain Kursk, which they now almost certainly have completely done. So we'll see. It is now the campaign season. The weather is favourable to this. So if there's going to be some sort of push from either Kharkiv or Belarus across the border into northern Ukraine, which would open up a new front altogether and threaten Kiev again, that's plausible, but I have to say, I don't see in my material, I don't see those troop concentrations quite with the obvious intent and preparation to move across the border. But these days, the technique is not to mass your troops, because if you mass them, they can be attacked pretty easily with missiles and drones. So you've got to keep your troops dispersed and bring them together very quickly and then move quickly.
Yeah.
So far, the Russians don't look as if they're about to do that, but that could change in a matter of days.
Right.
If we start to see forces come together, and then they're off within 24 hours after having, as it were, coalesced into core-sized units.
So Zelensky, speaking at the 3Cs summit just in the past days, has said, look at Belarus. This summer, Russia's preparing something there under the guise of military exercises, and it's going to be Zapad 2025, which is the military exercise between Russia and Belarus. The last one in 2021, when they had 200,000 troops there for these military exercises, ostensibly, of course, was just 6 months or so before they invaded in February 2022.
Right. And they'll do the Zapad exercises again.
It means West, right? Zapad is.
That's right. Yes, the Western preparation exercises. But the issue is whether the Russians have got enough troops that they can put into this sort of thing. We knew that they were preparing it. We've been saying now for over a year, spring 2025 is the earliest time that one side or the other might be able to launch a strategic offensive. So the Russians, working on Belarusian territory, will certainly bring troops to an exercise, but whether they will become assault troops is still not clear. It's plausible, but I wouldn't say it's not the most likely thing to happen at the moment.
Just a final thought on it then. I mean, we saw how they failed. As you said, they went straight into the Pripyat marshes in the first attack there. What will they have learnt from that, and is that still the best salient for them to attack from, even?
Well, their best way of getting to Kyiv is actually via Kharkiv, to Kharkiv and Sumy, up in the northeast. If they come directly south, which is what they tried to do, that's where they got into a mess. But partly that was the time of year. So it was 22nd of February, 2022, when it was still in the winter, it was still very wet, and that great convoy, remember this enormous convoy? And everyone was saying this convoy went to the west of Kiev and then it didn't do anything. And then it sort of just withdrew. Well, it wasn't a convoy, it was a traffic jam.
I remember days of us looking at the pictures of it.
That's right. Because the ground was so wet that I think it was 3 different tactical battle groups actually went onto the same roads and got themselves completely snarled up, and all their supplies were at the back and all their armour was at the front, and they just couldn't get from one to the other. And so they just made themselves look ridiculous in what was a massive traffic jam. At the time, it looked like a combat column. But when you actually looked at it, it wasn't at all. And the Ukrainians then were very careful, very clever, because they hit it. They didn't go for the armour, they went for the fuel trucks and the ammunition trucks. They hit all its supplies, so it just got stuck.
Wow. Is that when they started using the NLAWs?
Yes, that was the NLAWs, the British anti-tank weapon, which was very good, and it really made a difference. And they just picked them off. The Ukrainians just picked off the vehicles that made a real difference. And that convoy was just a pointless military exercise. It went terribly wrong. I mean, the Russians, I have to say, are far better now than they were then. They've learned, as all armies do, so they won't make that mistake again. But I mean, they still, to my mind, they still can't put together an aggressive combined arms operation for an offensive, a really sort of strong offensive, because that's just not the way they do things. They're on their third army now. You know, they're into the third iteration of their army. And after very basic training, all these soldiers are going straight to the front lines, to frontline units, where all they're doing is conforming to the old-style Soviet battle plan.
Which is what, wave attacks?
Putting wave attacks in and just pushing people forward, using people letting people get shot. In order to find out where the Ukrainians are sitting, to find out where the Ukrainian firing points are, literally sacrificing their men, their foreign contract soldiers very often, or their convicts, using them as human targets so that they can work out where the Ukrainians are. And the Ukrainians, of course, have learned that after a first wave, they move. They don't sit in the same firing points for more than a few minutes at a time.
Does the fact that they've got thousands and thousands of drones, they know how to use drones now, would that change the way that you would do an assault?
Yeah, that's one of the elements of a combined arms approach, is using drones. But again, you've got to put the rest together. You've got to be able to get this air-ground coordination. You've got to get infantry working with armour in ways that the Russians used to be able to do, but they don't seem to at the moment. So again, I mean, yes, they can mass troops, but whether they can really push the sort of offensive that they haven't managed from the very beginning of this war, in this spring, summer, we'll have to see. I personally doubt it.
Okay.
And they're under enough pressure elsewhere, down in the south around Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, trying to push towards into Zaporizhia. They're making such slow progress. I think that the troops they've got and the units they've got, I think they'll be putting them down there to make more progress, where they've been sort of pushing away all during the winter without much success, or very marginal success, at very high cost. So I think they'll feed them in down there rather than open up a completely new offensive area, which does have the capability to go wrong.
Absolutely. Definitely want to watch, though, I suppose, when those drills begin, because we'll have oversight when we'll be able to see where they are.
We'll see it quite soon. If it's going to happen, something will happen, because the weather is now favourable to it. But we'll see what it is.
Okay. All right. We'll park that there, like that column was parked on that road on the way into Kyiv. And we'll move on to this question here from Sean. What are Professor Clarke's views on the images we saw over the weekend at the Pope's funeral? This is, of course, that amazing picture of President Trump and President Zelensky sitting just meters apart on those little chairs. On those little chairs you might have a wedding or something, in deep conversation. But the extra point that Sean wants to make is, what can we learn from Macron not being involved? I did hear some reporting that he was meant to be part of the talks and then wasn't. I think he brought them together and then... Yeah,
the dynamics of this are quite interesting, because as groups were walking through the Basilica, these chairs suddenly appeared, and Keir Starmer and Prince William were walking toward it, and Prince William very constitutionally thought, I better not be part of this, and he walked away. Keir Starmer sort of didn't go too close towards it. Macron saw the American and Ukrainian presidents coming together, and he went towards them and started to talk to them. And he sort of vigorously shook hands, and he hugged Zelensky, and he shook hands with Trump. And Trump apparently told him, according to the lip readers who've been through this, Trump said, you shouldn't be here, you need to go. And Zelensky nodded, and so Macron sort of melted away. And then one of the clerics took one of the chairs away. So then there were two chairs, and they sat there in front of the baptismal chapel, St. Peter's baptismal chapel, toward the end of the basilica. And they leant together in the most intimate sort of diplomatic meeting you can ever imagine. In the world of diplomacy, you don't get sort of meetings quite like that. I thought they were going to kiss each other at some point.
They were very close.
It was strange. However, that 15-minute meeting, let's say it's the Basilica moment. And how does that compare with the Oval Office moment of the 28th of February? Of the two, I think the Oval Office moment is the authentic one. The Basilica moment was the moment when it might have softened Trump's opinion a little bit, but I don't think it will have changed.
Is that really how you see it, Michael? You think that the Oval Office was the authentic Trump, and what we saw at St. Peter's was
and the Basilica moment, I think, was it was a moment, but I don't think it will change Trump's approach to what is happening in Ukraine. And the Oval Office moment, I mean, it was manufactured, but the intention was to lean hard on Zelensky. And I don't think the Basilica moment, as I would call it, is going to change that policy. I think it just makes Trump maybe a bit more angry with Putin, and we're seeing that come through this week. And so, I mean, Trump has been quite critical of Putin, but in rhetoric, but he hasn't done anything.
No.
I mean, he hasn't initiated any sanctions. He hasn't changed any policy. He's just said he's displeased with Putin.
And he hasn't offered the extra munitions and weapons and funding that is about to run out.
Nothing like it. I mean, no American policy has changed as a result of what happened in St. Peter's Basilica. I wish it had, but it didn't.
One thing that maybe was a part of that is this decision by Putin to announce the ceasefires. What do you think? Did that come hard on the back of that?
Yeah,
moment, do we think?
Yeah, it did. So Trump, leaves the Pope's funeral and creates these two quite critical statements about Putin, and he clearly is running out of patience. And then, so Putin comes up with a unilaterally declared 3-day, 72-hour ceasefire that will span the May the 9th Victory Day celebrations in Moscow, very important day in Moscow's military year, and that's meaningless in a way. It's too far away from the American point of view. The Americans wanted something this week. A 3-day unilaterally announced ceasefire is not a 30-day all-round ceasefire in air, ground and sea. And in a way, it's Putin trying to offer a little crumb to the Americans to keep them involved without actually having to do anything significant. And as we've seen today, I mean, Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, has said, the pieces can't be negotiated so quickly. These things are bound to take a long time. And of course, he's talking about a peace deal. But the issue that Trump was talking about is a ceasefire. And there's a huge difference between a ceasefire, where at least we stop fighting for 30 days, and a peace deal, which is something that needs a great deal of negotiation. Yeah. And the Russians are always trying to confuse these two things. And the Americans seem to be falling for it. Every time the Americans talk ceasefire, the Russians talk peace deal.
Yeah.
So they throw ceasefire into a complicated mix of problems. But Zelensky, I mean, 7 weeks ago now, offered a total, an unconditional 30-day ceasefire as the Americans requested.
And let's remember, as the Americans requested, he went against what he had already originally said. He gave concessions. I mean, it was essentially that he would accept the terms of this, whatever, to bring about a stop in the fighting.
Yeah, he's already given a great deal. And both in principle and in practice, and that's not enough, because the Russians, as we've said so often, the Russians don't want a ceasefire because they think they've got more to gain by continuing to fight. So they want to string it all along so that they don't completely alienate the United States, but they certainly don't want U.S. policy to succeed.
Okay. Question from Kay on the ceasefires, and the word ceasefire has been used here, not peace deal. Who needs these ceasefires more?
Ukraine.
Right.
They need a ceasefire because they need a break, and they just need a breather. And whether a ceasefire would be stable, I would doubt, but it would last for a little while, and then it would probably break down. The Russians genuinely don't want a ceasefire. I'm sure their soldiers on the front line do, because they're exhausted. They're still losing on average 1,300 men a day, every day. So they, on the front line, they'd love a ceasefire. But strategically, the Russians still believe, whether correctly or not, that they will continue to make gains if they keep on fighting. But, you look at the gains they've made since Christmas, they are absolutely minimal. But they sort of believe, now that we're into the campaign season, now the weather's better, they'll make some bigger gains. And the Ukrainians feel that, I think, that they can hold off the Russians, but I see no sign that the Ukrainians have got any other surprise packages up their sleeve. They might have, but anything else that they could do to actually give the Russians something to worry about.
Well, Question from Tiffin then on that, something for them to worry about. Is Putin's request for a ceasefire in order to ensure his parade is not drone attacked?
I doubt it, because they'll have thought of that one already.
Right.
The possibility of a drone attack in Moscow on the day of the parade, which would be a nuisance, but it would be symbolically very, very embarrassing. I think you can guarantee the Russians will have thought of that. And although their air defence is not nearly as good as they used to think it was, they will have everything on full alert, I think, during the period of the Victory Day parade.
Well, Greg Holton sent a question from YouTube. Thank you very much for that, Greg. And it's on swarm attacks. Will Ukraine have the capability to launch waves of thousands of drones towards Russian targets this year?
Yes, in principle, they've produced a great many drones. They're producing lots of them. They're remarkably innovative, and they're producing them at scale, as they say. So they're producing well over 1 million drones a year themselves, quite apart from those which are donated or are in joint production with Western, very often small companies. So, and they're the Ukrainians, I would say, are the leading user of drones in the world at the moment. They are the most innovative. I mean, the Russians are pretty good as well because they've learned, but the Ukrainians are still ahead of them technologically and in terms of innovation. So, and yes, I mean, that's a very good phrase to use, swarms of drones, because that's what makes the difference.
Yeah.
Any individual drone is pretty vulnerable. It's maybe small. It can be shot at, and it can be disrupted. But if you can launch a swarm of drones, I mean, let's say 50 or 100, 200, then it's very hard to do anything about that number all coming together. And we're on the verge of a real revolution in drones as AI is able to develop swarms of drones. So if it
organize the way that the swarm operates, right?
So you launch, let's say, I mean, we're not far away from this now, a swarm of drones, say, I don't know, 1,000 drones across an area that you've pre-designated as a combat area. And the drones are able to, in effect, talk to each other to find their own targets, to work out how to attack the targets, which groups to use. I mean, the Ukrainians have already done a bit of this in the way that they've attacked ships, because they've used some of their Sea Baby drones in 3 groups, where one group attacks a ship from one side, another group from another side, another group holds back. And they've worked that out themselves. They're not being directed from 300 miles away. They're programmed to work out the best way to attack the ships. And these sea drone babies have been remarkably effective.
Sorry, when you say programmed, so they've got predetermined waypoints, or are they actually working things out as they're going along, seeing where the target's moving to?
Yeah, they work it out for themselves. I mean, this is autonomous warfare, and of course people get very worried about this, because where's the ethical element in it? Where's the human in the loop? Well, there's always a human in the loop, but the way it would work, or the way it does work, is that the commander would say, all right, for the next 6 hours, this zone of 3 kilometres by 3 kilometres is a free fire zone. Everything in that zone is hostile, is what you might say. Or everything in this zone apart from that building and that building is hostile, and we'll let the drones work out the best way to attack them. I mean, this is already being done in air defence, because now, air defence has to be so fast, particularly on ships. So a missile launcher has to swing around to defend against, let's say, 10, 12 targets at once. You can't let somebody in the control room work out which target is closest. The system has to work it out.
Right.
So you turn the system on, and the system works out its own priorities for which targets to go for first, and to identify which are the incoming missiles which are really dangerous, and which, say, incoming drones are less dangerous. So, how do you prioritize? You don't just go for the one that's nearest. You go for the one that's the greatest threat. So we already live in the era of autonomous warfare. And that's about to become a much, much bigger area of war. And it does raise ethical questions, because although in theory, yes, of course, there's always a person there, but that person is getting further and further away from the tactical decisions over what is targeted.
Yeah, I think it's the difference between, was it in the loop or on the loop of the decision making?
Yeah.
Michael, we won't talk about drones for the rest of it, because I could. But there is one thing that I've been reading about recently in terms of drone use, and it's fiber optic drones connecting to like a 10-kilometer cable that stops them being jammed in terms of electronic warfare. So you can't knock them down. So these ones are even more dangerous.
They are in a way, but they're more limited too. I mean, the Russians have been using them pretty successfully. So because drones can be electronically jammed, and there's a constant arms race between the electronic systems and the jamming systems, the Russians have gone back to a very obvious safest thing in really just put a copper wire on it and just let the wire run out as the drone goes forward. And because it's direct communication via the wire, unless you can snag the wire in some way, then the drone can't be jammed. But that's limited because it's got to fly only for as long as the wire is.
Yep.
And if you're going to launch 1,000 drones, it's not practical really to have 1,000 strings of wire going 3 kilometers across the fields. So they are very effective in close quarter drone operations, and they have been effective, and they've really hurt the Ukrainians. But there are ways of getting around that. But to every offense, there's a defensive counter if you can come up with it, and if you can afford to do it in time.
You get it there in time and get it in the right place at the
Exactly,
right time.
yeah.
And also practicability question, Michael. I suppose you wouldn't have thought it was practical. Many of the innovations that we've seen in this war in the early stages that now are just normal. I mean, I don't know about this sort of first-person view drones and whether or not that was going to be
drones,
completely. You would have thought at the beginning of the war that was going to be something that was so vital. Because things move on so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, to begin with, the drones in the war were, the Bayraktar drones, the Turkish Bayraktar drones were very effective. But they're just like small aircraft. I mean, they more or less the size of an aircraft, dropping or firing missiles at tanks, which are very effective. And then these FPV drones are literally hobby drones of the sort you could buy from most supermarkets, basically. But if you have them adapted simply to drop a grenade or a small bomb, they're big enough to lift a bomb, you use them instead of artillery. And that's what the Ukrainians have done. They've used so many FPV drones as a compensation for their lack of artillery shells. And now, I think 60% of all of the casualties they are inflicting on Russian front lines are from drones rather than from shells. They'd rather use artillery shells. I mean, they would. It's just easier and simpler, but they don't have the enormous level of shells that they need to compete with the Russians. I mean, the Russians are still firing 15 to 18,000 shells a day, whereas the Ukrainians are lucky if they've got 5,000 shells a day to fire.
Right. I told you I could talk about drones all afternoon. I brought another question in. I didn't even mean to do it, Michael. Right, let's move on to some other business. You've got a question here from Seamus. Thank you for this. And this is about North Korea. What do we make of the technological advancement from North Korea having just shown their new destroyer? This is something the world should be watching. I looked up this destroyer. It's a Chohyun class destroyer.
Chohyun. Yeah, they launched it or unveiled it last week. It's interesting, actually. It's only about 5,000 tons, which is smaller than most. I mean, our Daring-class destroyers are about 9,000 tons, and the American equivalent, the Arleigh Burke class, are about the same, about 9,000 tons. So this is quite small. It's not, it's 2/3 the size, really. But the thing about destroyers is that they're much more lethal now than they ever were before. They're a more important ship than they've ever been for the last 100-odd years.
Why is that?
Because during the Second World War, the 50s, they were convoy escorts. They were useful small ships. They could zip around and so on. Now they're small ships, but they carry lots of armament, particularly missiles.
Right.
And so they can carry depth charges and things like that, but they carry anti-air missiles. So their prime job is to defend against air attack, to defend another ship and themselves against air attack. But also they can carry missiles that can be anti-ship missiles, so ship-to-ship, or ship-to-shore missiles, or cruise missiles. The North Koreans are saying that it's this particular destroyer, the Chohyun, is capable of carrying nuclear-tipped missiles, which is plausible.
Really?
But this is their first destroyer. They've never produced one before. This one almost certainly was produced with the help of the Russians. And is it important? Well, it's important because it shows the level of their ambition. I mean, for a bankrupted state that makes most of its income on criminal activities around the world, and that's absolutely true, they do, for a state like that, they have the ambition to develop some sort of offensive navy. But a destroyer is a potent ship to produce, and there'll be a lot of interest in how this one seems to perform on its sea trial.
Is it just the one? I mean, do they have a fleet of them for now? I mean, how useful is it to have just the one? Right.
First one. The South Koreans have a reasonable sized navy. The North Koreans almost never have. They've had inshore vessels.
So I see.
Yeah.
So it's that step towards that.
Exactly. They have aspirations to a modern lethal navy, and they've produced what I imagine is a fairly capable ship, but we'll see.
So short answer to Seamus, worth watching, yes?
Yeah.
definitely. All right, question here from Paul. With Putin's mutterings, Paul's words, about NATO expansion being one of his root causes for the invasion, should Ukraine make it a condition of any peace negotiations that Russia ceases to expand the CSTO, as it effectively did recently when Russia signed the treaty with North Korea, as it's a security threat to Ukraine? I'm sure everyone watching this knows what the CSTO is, but you should probably tell everyone what it is, Michael, before we talk about it.
The Collective Security Treaty Organization. It's like Russia's sort of mini NATO. So it consists of, let's see, Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan.
Yeah, I love it.
Tajikistan, 6, yeah?
Yep, that's right,
got
6.
There.
I've got it here.
So
I wasn't testing you, Michael, I was.
Oh, yeah, all right.
You got it all right.
6. Okay. And it's a collective security treaty organization. It's not very effective, really. They have annual exercises. They don't matter very much because Russia is so much the powerful military player in all of that group. I mean, Armenia is in a state of military collapse at the moment, having lost 2 wars to Azerbaijan now. Belarus is Belarus. And, I mean, Kazakhstan is a big country, big and important country. But, I mean, the Kazakhs even are kind of peeling away from Russia a bit because they fear Russian ambitions in northern Kazakhstan. And what the questioner also says is, what about the North Korean involvement? Well, that's not part of the CSTO because that goes back to this security cooperation agreement, which the Russians and the North Koreans developed in autumn of last year. Was it October last year? October 24?
Well, before the troops were sent to help in Kursk.
Yeah, it was part of the. It was the sort of the arrangement under which the troops were sent. I think it was October 2024.
I can find it for you.
Mainly check that one out. But anyway, that's a separate deal. But again, it's not an invalid point to say that the Russians require all sorts of concessions, all sorts of sweeteners from the West, which they are not prepared to observe themselves. They want to have a NATO light sort of organization. They want to have lots of security arrangements with other countries, but they regard it as somehow threatening when Western countries do the same.
So it could be part of any negotiations if we were to take them seriously.
I don't think it would get very far. That's all.
That's what I was going to say, because you can't really take.
No, and I can promise
word,
you that NATO doesn't spend too much time worrying about the
CSTO. It's not like they're going head to head.
No.
So there's a mutual defence provision between Russia and North Korea signed in June of 2024. It came into force in December of 2024.
Ah, okay, yeah, okay,
Which is the agreement. Right. I mean, the CSTO signed in 1992, and as you say, I think
that's right. That was the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that was like the security arrangement between the previous republics of the USSR. So they had that general arrangement, which was collective security, and it has I think it's Article 2 in it, which is a bit like NATO's Article 5.
Right.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
And they were sent to. I have to check this out. Kazakhstan or Tajikistan not long ago to support the president who was.
Yeah. I mean, the Russians bailed out the Kazakhs against an internal revolt. Yeah.
So they used, but maybe not much use.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to a question here from Rich. How have Ukraine's forces evolved over the course of the conflict to ensure that they've remained seemingly so effective in holding back Russia's much larger military, despite the well-documented delays in funding from the West?
Yeah, I suppose the simple answer to that is that they've evolved really well as a defence force, but not well enough as an offensive force. So they've proved really clever and resourceful and brave at defending, no question about that. And they've defended very adequately. But they've only gone into the offence twice in the war. So once in the autumn of 2022, when they conducted these really terrific surprise offensives in Kharkiv and in Kherson. But in both cases, a lot of deception was involved, and they were able to attack the Russians when the Russians were weakest and when they'd moved troops out. So they attacked 2 weak spots in Russian order of battle, and got away with it and did really well, and thought then, oh, look, we can retake lots of territory. That was the first time, very successful, and the West was very impressed by what they did. The second time, of course, was the following summer with all this Western equipment they got. Lots of things went wrong then. They waited far too long, and they showed that they were not really capable of running a big strategic offensive against a front that had been expecting it for a long time and had dug in the Sorovikin line, these massive line of mines and defensive works. They just couldn't get through it. And so, I think that has told us that the Ukrainians are good at defending, but they've still got a certain amount of way to go before they could attack in the way a Western army, a NATO army, would be able to attack if it ever had to.
We'll not dwell on it too long, Michael, but I suppose having a much smaller force would make some of those offensive manoeuvres more challenging, or not?
Oh, they do, no doubt. I mean, the point about offense is it's. I mean, any military professional will tell you, you've got to hit hard and keep going.
Right.
I mean, there's room for feints and decoys and so on. But at the main point of attack, wherever you think the main point of attack is, you've got to hit it hard and don't stop.
Yeah.
You've got to keep the enemy off balance. It's not too difficult to get an enemy off balance, but then you've got to keep them off balance, keep pushing before they can reorganise themselves.
Before we move on to the quick fire questions, Michael, we've got a question here from YouTube again, from Chaotic Phoenix. Thank you for this. This widens things out slightly here. So will the current situation between India and Pakistan cause the Ukraine conflict to be sidelined in a significantly negative way? Thoughts?
Yes, it might.
Are you worried about that potential of that turning into a hot?
The India-Pakistan tension is not actually about anything that has to be resolved. It arose from this one attack in India-dominated Kashmir. But I mean, Kashmir has been a flashpoint since 1947, since Indian independence. It was largely blamed on Mountbatten, the last Governor General of India, who made the wrong decision for all sorts of reasons I won't go into. And Kashmir,
podcast on that.
Yeah, but and Kashmir has been a real problem between India and Pakistan since. If this becomes a shooting war, it'll be because both sides are prepared to push it to one. They don't have to. They don't have to go to war over this. They really don't. They can bury the whole thing because it was a really nasty incident, which doesn't have to be escalated. One side has not attacked the other. One side has not invaded the other. The Indians are blaming the Pakistanis for not doing enough about these different groups, and nobody still knows who was responsible for this. Lashkar-e-Toiba LET is still the group that is in the frame for it, but we don't know. But it doesn't have to become that. If it did become a shooting war, then yes, it will take a lot of the attention away from the immediate events in Ukraine, because India and Pakistan are both nuclear powers.
Yep.
And if they then go into, I think, a fourth significant war with each other, then it would be different to the previous three.
It certainly would. I mean, as you say, nuclear armed. And we had the defence minister on with our colleague Yalda Hakim just over a week ago, talking about there will be a full response from Pakistan if
there will be.
Attack.
But I mean, that's what's so frustrating about this. There doesn't have to be. There absolutely doesn't have to be. Nobody's national interests are at stake.
But rhetorically, they're both sides talking themselves.
They simply have to deal with this really nasty incident that neither government is fully responsible for.
Right, let's move on to the quickfire, Michael. As you say, park that one because we could definitely do a
we'll probably come back to that
on that. I think so. All right, move on to the quickfire. Stoopy. First question: is there a weapon within the British arsenal that could at least clear pockets of Russian soldiers from Ukrainian territory? Something more effective than Storm Shadow?
No, not in the British infantry.
Okay,
we've
said our best.
Yeah, I mean, that's the best way of I mean, and Storm Shadow is against installations, not against personnel. The anti-personnel weapons we've had in the past include napalm, of course. We don't have it now. Yep. We do have, but you know, the Ukrainians have developed their own version of napalm, and they've used it in some of the wooded areas. It's like phosphorus, and they've trailed it across trenches, and it just burns.
Nasty stuff.
Yeah, I mean, on the battlefield, there's an ambiguous legal status. It's absolutely illegal to use in any civilian areas. But the Ukrainians have developed a certain amount of it. We've seen it, but they've not used it so extensively because it's not that easy to get over the trenches. That's sort of the ability to kill a lot of troops who are dug in really requires aircraft or helicopters to get over the top of them, and that's a very dangerous thing to do.
It is the quick fire, but I want to do a quick follow-up because there are reports that the Russians are using like a tear gas, CS-type gas.
Oh, they are, yeah. No, the CS gas they do. And again, on the battlefield, that's illegal.
Yep.
You can use CS gas against riots in your own country because it's under certain regulations. But on the battlefield, A, it can be used in very high concentrations, and B, CS gas has the effect of forcing people out of their trenches and buildings, and then you shoot them. And so it is actually it's a banned weapon of war, interestingly, CS gas. And the Russians are using it very extensively.
Right, move on to the next question here from Kevin. After World War II, the UK paid reparations to the USA for decades to pay back munitions, etc. Will the same apply to the aid that we in Europe have supplied to Ukraine to quite rightly support them during their invasion?
It doesn't have to, no. I mean, what the Europeans have provided for Ukraine, and the Americans too, until the Trump administration, who are still ambiguous about this, was a gift. It was a gift in a common cause of defending liberal democracies against naked aggression. And that's as it was in the Second World War as well. Lend-Lease, to begin with, was a mixture of gift and loans then. Some of them were converted into loans. And I always remember the figures that Lend-Lease, the Americans lent Britain the equivalent of $31 billion that was in money then, which is about $750 billion now, about $750 trillion worth by modern standards. And we didn't finish paying for it. We paid it back it was 2006, famously, was the time when we finally paid it all back. So yes, that could be done. And there are all sorts of schemes which are mooted and which we may now come back to say, why don't we lend Ukraine a huge amount of money, let them develop whatever they want, and give them 50 years to pay it. I mean, we spent over 60 years paying back our debt for the Second World War. Yep. So we were gifted a lot of stuff, and we borrowed a lot of money. It took us 60 years to pay it back, and we were fighting for our lives. That's the scale of the challenge.
I suppose this would be outside any of the 300 billion of Russian seized assets that could be used as well.
Yeah, I mean, that could be used. I mean, 210 billion of that 300 and odd is sitting in European banks, most of it in Belgium. My view is give it to the Ukrainians. I mean, it's legally challengeable, and there's a legal argument both for using it and not using it. But my view is that this has reached the point now where we give it to them. I mean, just let them have it, and we can argue with the Russians for the next 50 years over whether it was the right thing to do or not.
We must. All right, Bruce, question here. Is it feasible for the Ukrainians to ignore the ceasefire, puts it in speech marks because I don't think he believes it's going to be a ceasefire, and carry on defending their country from the invasion? What are the consequences if they don't abide by it? That's interesting because we don't know what the terms of this thing are, do we?
No.
Really?
I mean, my guess would be, if I was Zelensky, I'd say if the Russians are doing a 72-hour ceasefire, we will match it because it would look bad if we didn't.
Right.
And it would look bad in the United States. And to be honest, a 72 hours break for the boys and girls on the front line will be quite useful too. So if I was them, I'd say we'll match it, but we don't take it very seriously. But if you're going to stop for 72 hours, we'll stop for 72 hours.
Question here from Ross Trigembo. Why do countries publicly announce the weapons they're sending to Ukraine? Doesn't this just alert Russia and give them an advantage? Wouldn't it be smarter to keep all war-related support confidential to avoid helping the enemy?
Well, I mean, quite a lot of support has been kept confidential, of various sorts, intelligence, special forces, and so on. So there's a fair amount of confidential stuff that has gone backwards and forwards. But the reason, it's a good question. I mean, the reasons why all these things are announced is partly to show the Russians that the West is supporting Ukraine, partly to encourage each other that we're giving tanks. Well, are you giving tanks? We're giving aircraft. Are you giving aircraft? And also to announce to the world that the NATO powers, we're talking about up until this year now, but the NATO powers were united in their opposition to what Russia was doing. So the announcements were really political. And the Russians, would know what was coming. There was no surprise to them. I mean, what was turning up in Ukraine, and the things that we would not want them to know about, I mean, have been kept fairly secret.
Yeah, okay. Michael, thank you for that. And as you answered that, it just occurred to me how little we've mentioned President Trump this week. We mentioned him, I think, in the first or second answer. You said it, Michael. I'm not saying anything. All right, Lee88, still in the quickfire, remember. I read something recently about Ukraine having increased its domestic capacity to produce drones so much that it no longer has to rely much on other countries for parts, etc. How significant is this?
Correct, yeah. It's very significant, as we said before. Ukraine is now the world's foremost drone producer, both in terms of sheer numbers and the innovation of them. But it still needs components. So it still needs, very often straightforward components, or fairly straightforward ones, and it still needs them from the West. But it's getting a fair few of them, and it's linking in not so much with the big players in the West, like BAE Systems or Rheinmetall, although it does a lot of work with them, but it's the small companies, the SMEs, who often, in producing video games, hobby drones, they've got the components that the Ukrainians can use and adapt.
Absolutely. Okay, Michael, that is the quickfire complete. I don't think I shouted at you for keeping to time. I think you kept excellently to time then, all within 30 seconds.
That's fine.
Very well done. Let's move on to the final couple of questions now, and we'll start with this final question here. It's about the coalition of the willing. Phrase we heard a lot about a couple of weeks ago, not so much now, but the question here comes from John. What could troops from any coalition of the willing actually do in Ukraine? Could they actually enter combat, or would they be lame duck deterrence?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question now, because if it looks as if a ceasefire is not going to take place, and that's how it looks at the moment, then what this coalition of the willing could do is very limited. First of all, if there were a ceasefire, then the coalition of the willing would have to be big enough to make a difference. And it would have to be bigger than reportedly it can be. I mean, we're talking about 50, 60,000 troops. Latest reports are that the Europeans between them would be lucky to be able to put together 20 or 25,000. But we'll see about that. But if there is no ceasefire, the thing that they're most likely to do is to take their training missions and do them in Ukraine.
Right. Rather than bringing troops here.
Exactly.
We'll train them there.
Rather than the Interflex operation, which we run here at certain bases in Britain, would actually take place in Western Ukraine. And of course, to a degree, they'd be vulnerable because the Russians might target them. But they'd be, somewhere around Lviv or, quite near the border. And it'd be the symbolism of having Western troops, as it were, helping their friends in Ukraine. Would it make any difference to what happens on the front line? Probably not. And I think the issue, in terms of Western coalition of the willing, it's more likely to be more effective if we're talking not about troops on the ground, but maybe an air defence zone.
Right. Or
an attempt to maintain some sort of either ceasefire or status quo in the Black Sea.
Yeah.
So maritime and air is possibly more plausible than anything the troops on the ground might be able to do.
Going to my notes, John Healey, just like last week said, secure the sea, I think, and make safe the sky. Words to that effect, right?
Keeping the corridor, Ukraine's corridor open from Odessa and Chornomorsk down to the Bosphorus. That corridor is open now, but it's obviously quite dangerous. But making it more secure with Western would it be air power, really, because we wouldn't be able to send any warships into the Black Sea unless Turkey allowed it, which they probably won't. But nevertheless, helping to keep that corridor more secure would be a useful thing for the Ukrainians, and it would be a message to the Russians that we're not backing off.
Okay. Final question, Professor Clarke. Appreciate it. As always, this one comes from Wagil90. In what capability areas does Professor Clarke think European states are most lacking? And if he were to spend the 150 billion euro rearmament fund, what would he prioritise?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. The 150 billion rearmament fund in the EU is only the first instalment. The bill that they think they need to meet ultimately will be 800 billion. That was the first idea.
Wow.
But there's a 150 billion fund now, which can be drawn upon, and Britain thinks that after we have a security treaty in next month with the EU, if all goes well, then we'll be part of that fund. It would make no sense if we weren't, because the Europeans need, or other European partners need, British expertise when it comes to security and equipment. What would I spend 150 billion on if I could? Two things, basically. One is to make up the gaps that have opened up over the last 10 or 15 years in everyone's defences, the worst gap. So we need more of everything, more sustainability, more ammunition, more logistics and backup. So you've got to spend quite a lot of it on that. But the other thing is that you've got to balance that against transformational technologies. So you've got to be prepared to retire things early, to retire systems that are going to go out of business by the 2035, get rid of them by 2028. Don't let them go to the end of their life, and then work to replace them with the new technologies of robotics, of electronic, the whole electronic spectrum, of advanced computing, and of it's called C4ISR, C4I-STAR, which is C is command, control, computing, and communication.
Excellent.
That's C4.
C4s.
And then I-STAR is intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance.
There'll be a quiz after this for you guys.
C4 I-STAR. And there's a whole suite of technologies which are pretty expensive, but if you get them right, then that gives you the ability to organise the sort of battles that we talked about earlier on in our conversation. So yeah, I'd spend some of it, quite a lot of it, on making good the lack of sustainability, and I'd spend then another portion of it, up to a third or maybe more, on the new technologies of, let's say, C4 I-STAR.
Excellent stuff. Professor Clarke, always a pleasure. Great to get your expertise, as always. We will speak again shortly. I've got a rush to be on television. I won't be here next week. I'm taking a week off, but I'm sure you will be here with someone else sitting in this chair.
Apparently. Yes.
And we do thank you again for all of your questions. Submit them again for next week, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Professor Clarke, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much for being with us.